So this report is focusing on supporting climate resilience and a just energy transition in Africa for key main reasons. Climate change has been and continue to be one of the most existential threats to economic growth, sustainable development on the continent of Africa, but also more widely to global sustainability of our common pool resource we call the planet. So we look at, in this report, first chapter is looking at the economic performance and outlook of the continent in the short to medium terms. Then chapter 2 looks at climate resilience and just energy transition in Africa. What does it mean for the continent? What does it mean for global sustainability? And what does it also mean for the climate negotiations that we've been having around the world for 27 years now? And then chapter 3 looks at a key question in terms of financing that resilience, climate resilience, and the just energy transition in Africa. What strategies are available for us? What are the policy instruments we have to be able to make that financing at scale that meets the needs of the continent, but also meets the needs of achieving the nationally determined contributions that was agreed in COP21. And then make some policy recommendations at several levels, national governments, development agencies like ourselves, and also the international community. So here in the first chapter, I will rush through it because I know the World Bank also works on this subject, especially focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. So the growth performance of the continent shows a resilient picture, if I would say. We saw a contraction in Africa of up to 1.9% in 2020, but a quick rebound to 6.9% in 2021. But because of the overlapping crises that we have, the geopolitical tensions, including the Russia-Ukraine war, imported inflation, and several other challenges that exist, including debt overhang on the continent, we expect a slowdown to 4.1% in 2022 and 2023 going forward. So the deceleration of this change in the base effects and other uncertainties also come from persistence of COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, Africa is still at 16% in terms of COVID vaccination. So the uncertainties as to the resurgence of that pandemic is still there. Climate change effects and all these geopolitical tensions that I have already mentioned. But as we all know, Africa is a very heterogeneous continent, different countries, different economic fundamentals and economic structures. So the impacts of the pandemic has also followed those differences, with Southern Africa seeing the greatest hit of up to 6% contraction in 2020, but has also rebounded to 4.2%. But we expect again, because of all these other persistent challenges that I've talked about, a slowdown to 2.5. The other regions we see the same, North Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa saw some contraction, not that deep as that of Southern Africa, but again has come back up in 2021, and we expect stable outlooks in those regions. One region of keen interest for me is Eastern Africa that did not see any contraction in 2020. So we're currently trying to dig deeper to understand what happened, how did they manage to do that, and so we are seeing some structural policies that are responsible for that, adoption of different kinds of inclusive financing innovations, and so on and so forth. This is an area we can all work together to better understand in terms of replication. Now, on the right side of the slide, we try to look at different economic structures to see whether the impacts varied for oil exporters and so on. And we find that tourism-dependent countries were the most hit by COVID-19, seeing a contraction of up to almost 13%. Next was the oil, other resource-intensive countries because of dependence on global markets for their revenues. And then the good news is that all these types of countries in terms of structures have also gotten back to positive growth. And we expect that positive growth to continue despite the current global crisis that we are facing. If you look at the macroeconomic fundamentals, two things jump out. One is the continued and increasing debt vulnerability challenges on the continent. We looked at the different types of economies, and the rise is consistent for each of them, whether it be oil exporters, non-resource intensive, and other resource intensive economies on the continent. So the black line there tells a story which I'd like us to think about. Given that we just came out of HIPC a few years ago, you see a continued rise of the debt crisis on the continent, of the debt challenges on the continent. So a lot of discussion has now been around COVID-19, but COVID was not the cause of the rising debt, but it only exacerbated it. So the issue here is, what are the structural issues and the debt ecosystem itself that has been creating this continued rise, both looking at the supply and the demand side. This is also an area that I would like us to work together on going forward to better understand why the continent seems to have continued to have these debt challenges even after the HIPC. Then the other one is the consumer price inflation, which is rising highly, not just in Africa, but everywhere else in the world. But the aspect in Africa that is of interest is imported inflation, which sometimes the countries are not able to control. So what implications that has for fiscal sustainability on the continent is a major challenge that we are still also looking into. Then the next natural question is, how do we finance recovery from COVID-19 and return to address to the poverty targets we had before COVID-19? And that analysis shows a very sobering picture that Africa needs $433 billion between 2020 and 2022 to recover from COVID-19 alone. And then even with that resource, if it is made available, it will take up to a decade before Africa can get back to pre-COVID poverty targets. So this is a major issue here, and many people, almost 29 to 30 million Africans, have been sliding into poverty, extreme poverty, because of the pandemic. And we also see that because of that lack of vaccination on the continent, and then the compounding impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war, we're expecting almost 2 million more people added to that in terms of getting into poverty in 2022 and 2023 if the crisis continues unabated. Then we turned our attention to looking at one of the fundamental systemic challenges that has continued on the continent and everywhere else and is growing more urgent by the day, and that is climate vulnerability and the climate readiness and climate resilience on the continent. So between 2010 and 2019, we see that Africa was the second most vulnerable continent in the world, second to South Asia, to climate change impacts. But on climate readiness, Africa is the least ready with regards to climate change. So what's going on here is also something that we'll delve deeper into in the report. But if you look at climate resilience, which is the topic of the report, Africa is also the least resilient continent in the world. In fact, many of the most vulnerable countries in the world are in Africa, and most of them in what we call the African Development Fund countries. And I think these are also countries that your IDA focuses on because of several factors, lack of capacity to prepare projects, the the depth of the financial markets are so shallow, and several issues that prevent these countries from accessing financing, both from the climate finance architecture, but also from the global financing architecture. So we try to then look at countries in Africa, and we see there are several differences in terms of access to, in terms of vulnerability and readiness to climate change based on economic characteristics of the countries as well. So this already tells me a story that growing economies is building climate resilience in countries. Because consistently what we find is that the higher the levels of economic growth, the more ready countries are to address climate impacts when they do occur. But in general, climate change has had significant socioeconomic impacts on the continent. By annual averages, if you look at between 1986 to 2015, climate-induced losses are estimated to 5 to 15% of GDP per capita growth in Africa. And again, when you look at that huge variation, it is also driven by the structures of the economy and levels of growth on the continent. But this is in addition to increased mortalities, the climate-induced conflicts, human displacements, migration, and other fragility-inducing factors that deepen the fragility and vulnerability of the country. So it's like a vicious cycle. The more vulnerable you are, the more impacts you have, and the more vulnerable you become. It's like digging deeper into major challenges that these countries are facing. So significant investments are required to be able to turn this trend on the continent, and I think also globally. But what we find if you do cost-benefit analysis and trade-offs on these, cost-benefit analysis and trade-offs are required in key sectors to determine what types of policies are required on case-by-case basis. There is no blanket rule in terms of how to address the issue here. But again, there are multiple co-benefits that exist in addressing climate change, that the huge costs that are involved should not deter countries from investing in doing that. The next thing we then looked at is a major sector, which is the energy sector, which is always central in climate policy discussions. Although in Africa, the fact is that CO2 emissions, a small amount of CO2 emissions are coming from the agricultural, forestry, land use sectors, not from the energy sector, because Africa's access to energy is still very low, and it's actually very much green in terms of when I go down into the presentation, we can see more of that. But here, this graph is just showing us the near perfect correlation or even perfect correlation between per capita access electricity consumption and GDP per capita. If you looked at HDI, you have the same kind of correlation. Every index of human well-being that is used, you find the same kind of correlation. So much so that you can almost use GDP, access to electricity as a proxy for GDP growth in countries. So what this simple graph is telling me is that when we have policies that is slowing down access to electricity consumption in countries, we're just directly slowing down GDP growth as well, which is a major policy goal for all countries. And the same way on poverty, human development index, and so on. So we need to find a way that we can create smart policies that is creating a decoupling of access to electricity from GDP growth instead of this kind of perfect correlation that we're still having now. And in Africa, we have very low access, just 550 kilowatt hour, compared to about 2,300 kilowatt hour in Asia. If you compare it with Europe and America, it's even the gaps are so much more. But then the major point here is understanding that correlation between access to energy, poverty alleviation, basically access to energy, and addressing all the other SDG goals that we have, so that we don't have policies that discriminates from growth because of addressing climate change. Then that led us to see how has countries done it, or have countries done it over time. So we looked at the energy mix of countries in different regions in Africa, China, European Union, India, and United States. And what you find there is that the coal, which is the gray bar charts in that area, still remain a huge and significant part of the energy mix of all regions. And the regions that has managed to transit and reduce the coal in their mix is that purple yellow line, which is natural gas. And you see a lot of that switch between coal and natural gas to more lesser polluting energy systems is by using natural gas as a transition fuel. And that has happened quite a lot in Africa. It has happened quite a lot in Europe and the United States. Some of the other regions, it has happened not that much. Now, another point I want to draw attention to is the green lines on top, the green bars on top, which is the renewable energy in the mix. And you find that only European Union has been able to raise the renewable energy in the mix for up to 13%. So it's still a very small part of the energy mix of countries. So the whole desire to transit from coal to renewable energy is not happening as fast as it should be, but there are reasons for that. Technologies and so many things are still in the development stages. So that again makes a big point that asking countries to switch from coal to renewables, jumping the other transition fuels that we can see there, especially gas, is not a realistic policy. So here, the key points we make from this slide then is that transition takes time, and we need to allow countries that opportunity to go in the right direction, which is decoupling instead of stopping. Okay. Then the second one is natural gas is a very good transition fuel that has served that purpose across regions and should continue to serve that purpose as well. If Africa used up natural gas reserves in the next decade, it may not raise CO2 emissions in Africa by 0.6%. So the polluting factor in natural gas is so small that if it's done properly, it actually could be dubbed green, if not greener, if not green. Yeah. Now, the share of renewable energy is still small. So the hope that we all had in the past decade of rapid expansion of renewable energy hasn't happened that much. So there is that impetus to drive that sector even further through investments and other things that we can talk about. But because we're focusing on Africa, I need to highlight that Africa's energy mix is the least carbon intensive of all the other regions. So again, another policy thing from there is that Africa is not the place to actually push for mitigation because there's hardly little to mitigate. And then you find again that there's also a misalignment in the policy discussions now because you see that revealed preference of most of the donor agencies, including us, World Bank, FDB, and so on driving and financing mitigation, much more than financing adaptation, which is much more needed on the continent. So here is just a simple analysis we did to try and see how can we optimize the carbon budgets of the world. We have a goal set in COP21, so we know how many tons of carbon we can emit in order to be able to reach net zero by 2020. We know how much has been utilized already. And what we find here is, of course, you see Africa has contributed very little, about 3%. 85% of the global carbon budget has been used up. More than 70% of that is by the advanced countries. And then the average carbon footprint per capita in Africa is 0.95 tons of CO2 equivalent. The total average allowed per capita globally is 2 tons per capita of CO2 equivalent. That tells me that Africa still has headroom to grow its economies, even by continuing to emit CO2, which is unavoidable in many cases. But that doesn't mean that Africa should then use technologies that will allow them to overtake the threshold that is allowed. But if you look at other countries like the United States, the footprint is about 14 tons of CO2 equivalent, which is multiples above the 2 tons required and multiples above what Africa has emitted so far. So if we use the social cost of carbon to try and quantify what this means in terms of financial flows, Africa's carbon credit is worth up to 4.8 trillion US dollars by 2050. And several other countries have significant carbon debts that needs to be, if we have to talk about distributive justice and operationalize the common but differentiated responsibility, which was a key aspect of COP21 agreement and all climate discussions that I have been participating in. Now, but this again is on the backdrop of a continent in Africa that has huge potentials in the raw materials, the components, the products, and the services required for green transitions. If you think about DR Congo only, the amount of battery minerals in that country could help drive the technologies for inclusive transitions, much for green transitions significantly for the world. So what we are having then is a continent that has huge potentials to lead in the green transitions, a continent that has not contributed to CO2 emissions and still has headroom. So arguably, policymakers can argue that they have a right to do what they want in order to grow their economy because they are not still breaking the COP21 agreement. But it will not be in the interest of the world, the global sustainability, if that is done. But we'll have a mismatch in terms of financing that will allow to unlock these potentials. And that's why we then focused on chapter 3 of this report to look at financing climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. In that, we found another thing that some key facts that is confounding to us. One is that climate finance has mirrored the global financing architecture, and therefore it is not well defined and it's very complicated. So the more vulnerable countries to climate change are not receiving climate finance. So what that means then is that climate finance flows is misaligned with climate vulnerability and risks. So that's, for me, is a misallocation of resources in the climate finance architecture. It raises significant discussions that we can all have with regard to how the financing architecture is structured, what is appropriate, because if climate finance was structured in order to help the countries in climate vulnerabilities, the fact we're seeing here is that they're not receiving it. So we need to look differently and redesign it if we want to make it effective. Then we'll look at what does this mean for Africa achieving the NDCs that was agreed in COP21. And then the total resources required by Africa to achieve the NDCs is about up to 1.6 trillion US dollars between 2020 and 2030. This gives us an average of about 145 billion US dollars annually. But Africa is still only receiving 18.3 billion US dollars annually between 2016 and 2019 that we looked at during this reporting. And that amount, because of that lack of clarity and complexity in the definition of climate finance, includes a lot of other resources that are supposed to be financing other policy goals, like poverty alleviation, from ODA resources, and also includes financing from MDBs, to which African member countries are also members and shareholders, which means they're also refinancing their own climate finance, which is really some form of double counting. So that lack of clarity is something that we need to look at. If you factor that in, we find that the climate finance flows to Africa is actually much smaller than the 18.3 billion we have talked about. But even if we take that 18.3 billion as the net, as the average we have so far, it leaves a financing gap of about 108 billion US dollars a year for this period up to 2030. Keep in mind that what was agreed in the COP is actually, or what the commitment by the developed countries is to provide 100 billion to all the developing countries, and even that commitment has not been met. Now, Africa alone needs 127 billion in order to meet the COP agreement, that is to implement the INDCs. I'm not talking about the carbon credit of Africa, which is 4.3 billion, 4.8 trillion. So if this trend continues, it's almost like clear that Africa will not meet its NDCs, and that simply means that the world will not succeed in addressing the climate challenge. Because climate change is a global commons challenge, so it doesn't matter how much more one region tends to try and address it. If all regions have not done it, CO2 emissions will mix freely in the atmosphere, and it will cause impacts freely anywhere. So it's in the interest of the global community to ensure that Africa, the island states, and other developing countries can address the climate challenge issues. So this leads us to a few policy recommendations. One is policy coordination. We need to look at climate policy from the perspective of it being one among 17 sustainable development goals that the world cares about. So climate change policy should not create trade-offs, but we need to emphasize the co-benefits in terms of poverty alleviation, access to energy, and so on and so forth. And smart policies exist that can make that happen. Second is building regional value chains. Here, one might wonder, how does it become a climate policy? Because currently what we have, the work we've done in the International Resources Panel, does show that the resource throughput and the resource footprint and the carbon footprints of products could be very high in the current trade systems we have, where battery minerals are mined in Congo and maybe shipped to China or US to produce the lithium-ion batteries. And the lithium-ion batteries are also shipped back. These shipments are happening on ships that are run by high carbon emitting technologies. So if you look at the carbon footprint or the embedded carbon on these products, even the solar panel is not really carbon neutral. So to achieve net zero, we need to rethink how we build a structural transformation in these countries to be able to localize as much as possible manufacturing of green products. Scaling investments in renewable energy and green energy technologies is a huge opportunity for Africa and the rest of the world. For Africa, for me, it's more about building competitiveness advantages. Africa has huge potentials in battery minerals and all the renewable energy technologies that are required for the green transition. But what Africa needs is the financing to unlock those potentials. So if the world invests in Africa to unlock those potentials without increasing the carbon footprint of products by exporting raw materials, it will be win-win for global growth and also poverty reduction on the continent, but also delivering economic benefits for the countries in terms of job creation and the rest of things that green technologies offer. Now, we also need to invest in institutional capacity of the countries for green projects and green transitions, because this is a new development paradigm, and for the continent to participate and be competitive, that capacity in the institutional capacity is fundamental for governance, for public financial management, for everything that is required in order to make development work in countries. Now, for the developed countries, where the three main points we're making here is that there is need for honoring the 100 billion commitment in climate finance that was made in COP15, if I remember well. This will serve to at least restore confidence in the global commitment to resolve to solve COVID-19, to solve the climate change challenges. But again, because of the needs, the huge needs of addressing the NDCs, financing climate change should not be seen as an incremental approach. If you want to build a flood defense system, You can't build it 90% because if it remains just even 1%, the waters will come in and it will destroy the infrastructure you are trying to protect. So that 100 billion is not enough. And there needs to be a discussion with regards to what that means, what the work we have now done in terms of financing NDCs in Africa, taking 120 something billion of Africa alone. What does it mean for climate financing going forward? We also need to think about what does it mean with this misalignment that we have seen, that countries that are more vulnerable to climate change are not receiving it. Do we need to tweak the climate finance platforms and how it is organized so that it can actually solve this misallocation of resources we currently see? These are questions that can be addressed and discussed, like in COP 2027 that is coming up in Egypt. But we need to expand and deepen innovative financing instruments. We have green bonds, sustainability linked bonds. There are several innovations that has been developed, but are all at neophyte stages now. We need to accelerate them so that we can harness financing for climate and going forward. But above all, we need increased concessional financing to support climate adaptation and just energy transitions in these countries that do not have access to them, our ADF countries and also your IDA countries. We need to try and do that. In conclusion, we conclude that one, because the nature of climate change as a global commons challenge, the world needs to start seeing it outside the window of development aid or support to countries. We need to start seeing it as a way of trying to solve a global commons challenge where one actor's action without the other actor's action is really almost meaningless. So we need to all work together to address this issue. Energy systems needs to be technologically adequate, cost optimal, and also viable. And that viability is in achieving three goals: improving growth potentials for countries, addressing the sustainability needs of countries in terms of reducing CO2 emissions and this decoupling I talked about, while at the same time creating jobs and addressing inequalities in societies, because otherwise other fragilities will engender more climate forcing impacts on countries. Decentralized energy systems is key. I've already talked about it. And ending on reminding all of us what it takes for Africa to meet the NDCs already agreed in COP21 is 1.6 trillion US dollars, not 18.3 billion that Africa has been receiving so much. And if we agree that climate change action is not incremental, then it makes very clear sense that we need to try and find ways of scaling climate finance flows to Africa and the other countries. And this is where the role of private sector comes in, because public resources may never really be able to meet that. And also the political will to do what we've done in COVID-19 response, which mobilized over 17 trillion within 2 years to address a global pandemic, because it was a global commons challenge. The climate change impacts is worse than COVID-19 because nature cannot negotiate with us. When it's angry, it's angry. And anything on its way suffers. COVID-19, we could have policies of lockdown and hide ourselves from it. When it's heat waves and all these things, it's difficult to hide. And the economic losses from climate impacts is already huge, up to 15% in some countries. So it makes economic sense to act quickly to solve this problem. Closing words for me, I'll quote Einstein. Um, in the middle of difficulties lies opportunities. So these things look gloomy, but let's look at the opportunities on what we can do to move these things forward. Second, he says also, reminds us we cannot use an old map to explore the new world. And speaking in the World Bank, I would like to say, even in the African Development Bank, IMF, and all the Bretton Woods institutions, I think it's time for us to rethink how we engage in development. Because somehow the models that were created for us in the 1940s have served this purpose. And maybe this is time for us to look at these global commons challenges, which are now the constraints on development. These were not the constraints at the time that these institutions were established. And that leads automatically to what Else Oyen, a Norwegian scholar, also said, that there is no social problem that can be reduced or even eradicated without distribution or redistribution of economic, political, and social resources. So we need to be willing to re-engage differently and maybe even cede some power to communities, to nation states, and so on in terms of making decisions on the pathways for transitions that works for them. Because there is there's hardly ever a silver bullet for development that works everywhere. Thank you.
All right, come on. Those of you online, I'm sure you have questions. I'm sure you have ideas. Oh, yeah. Why don't we start with, if while you guys are thinking, we'll go here. Okay, so Aparajita.
So first of all, thank you so much this presentation. There's something that I always struggle with in this, debate about climate in Africa, and I guess my thought is the following. So I take that the main message of your report is that Africa is not the place for mitigation. Let's focus on adaptation. That's one, right? And the policies that promote climate resilience or climate adaptation are essentially some of the same policies that promote economic development, right? So investments in energy, investments in infrastructure, agriculture, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's keep that aside. Now, the second point was that IDA countries and African countries contribute less than 1% to global emissions, right? And even if we were to just focus on economic development, right? Let's say we just focus on economic development for the next 10 years, the emissions would still be less than 2%, right? The global emissions would still be less than 2%. So then, this political thing around net zero and, climate co-benefits, I mean, how do we sort of, bring the focus back on economic development in some ways, right? Like, why do we have to pander to these political targets? Would be my first question. The second is, you mentioned right in the beginning of your presentation that there were some countries that did better in the recovery process, right? So you've got this situation where recovery is being faulted because of all these shocks, right? COVID, climate, conflict. And then there are some countries that actually did better. And I was wondering if you've tried it, your team can maybe dig deeper in terms of the heterogeneity across countries, and that were there some initial conditions that better predict which countries could do better in the recovery than others. Thank you.
Excellent. Can you hear us, those of you online? Because I just want to make sure that at least there's some sound check all the time. We don't really have the.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear.
We have Anthony's hand
Okay,
up.
Anthony, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, and good morning to you all. I think it's lunch hour your time, and thanks to Kevin for a very insightful presentation, as we have seen over the past few days that we've been having these engagements with our partners. The presentation lays out very important elements that the report covers, but I just wanted to amplify on a few things that I thought we could start looking at some of the opportunities, for instance, where Africa must also start basically thinking, because really the just energy transition for Africa is an African agenda, so to speak, and we need to be seen to be driving this agenda from our own doorstep. And for me, the starting point is maybe just reassessing to what extent the subsidies that we provide from fossil fuels are helping to sustain the emissions, or what can we do to try and basically rationalize these subsidies, which some have estimated to be about 4.3% of what Africa mobilizes in revenues per annum, or about 4% of the current debt burden. So you can see the challenges that these subsidies present to African economies. So rethinking our strategy on this will really help us to create this headroom that Kevin has been talking about. And we know that it could add at least significantly to GDP growth, but also more importantly, it will free resources to invest more in more climate resilient sectors, including agriculture, as well as the other forms of infrastructure that speak to the ideals of us transitioning to the green economy. The second element, and this we have highlighted in the report to some extent, is that the carbon markets really in Africa is not fully developed, but also the pricing, and we heard from the presentation, the pricing does not fully reflect the social cost of what the social cost of climate change. But what we have noticed is that by just imposing a 75 maybe cents per ton could raise additional revenues of about 40 billion to Africa's revenues. And you know, this is not a small amount, given the challenges that we have, including the financing requirements that we talked about for the recovery, but also to reduce poverty to pre-pandemic levels. One thing that we also highlight in the report is the opportunities that lie in the developing or deepening our capital markets. And here I speak specifically on the importance of exploring the opportunities that green bonds present to Africa. Given the small size of the green bonds market in Africa, I think that, and concentrated only in about 3 countries, which contribute about 97% of the total green bonds in Africa. What strategies really can our government start thinking on how to attract additional resources that will go to financing our climate needs, mobilized through our capital markets? The other challenge or the other opportunity that I see is this idea of the now emerging opportunities in the electric markets. I mean, electric car market. Numerous opportunities on the electric batteries, but given the endowments that Africa has, and I think it was highlighted towards the end of the report, is that Africa has huge opportunities in these rare minerals that everyone will now start transitioning into, as we all now start thinking of going towards the net zero transmission, net zero emissions. But what comes to mind for me is probably creating these regional value chains that Kevin emphasized on the policy recommendations. And I have an example here of what this can do, of what has been happening between the Zambian government and the government of DRC because of the shared resources, common resources that they have in these rare minerals, in cobalt, copper. And they are trying to come up with a framework that will create this regional kind of regional market based on the bilateral discussions that they've been having. And the MOU that they've signed to cooperate along these lines. So I think these are some of the opportunities that African governments need to start seizing where these opportunities lie in order for us to be able to create these additional ways to transition to net zero, but also to be able to allow the market to start playing their role in allocating resources towards the green economy and sustainable development as we now come to think of it in the years ahead. I thought I should just highlight those few elements, but I can always come in also at some point during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Anyone else who has a question or comment?
So my first question is on financing natural gas, especially from foreign countries, right? I've talked to German colleagues at the World Bank ED's office, being really mad about why are you guys allowing financing natural gas or other projects at home, but not abroad. And what they keep saying is stranded assets. So what do you say? What is your argument against that? Is it even a stranded asset, or is gas just a transition fuel, or are you saying no? It's for long term. So does that argument hold? And then the other question was so on the DRC and minerals. I was always wondering why most of the companies, I think the large majority of the companies investing in minerals in the DRC or investing in the mining in the mines are Chinese companies. European companies and American companies need the minerals as much, but are much more likely to get these minerals or source them from China. And apparently this is, so part of the reason is because they are being held accountable in their supply chains, and they're worried about social and labor standards and child labor and so on. So what is your advice to countries like the DRC to, make sure that these supply chains are more in line with regulations in especially European countries?
Okay, so the point I was trying to make was that currently Africa contributes approximately 2% of global emissions, right? Now, I've seen studies that have shown that even if the continent was to, the most, worst case scenario is that the continent's contribution to global emissions would maximum be about 5%. Now, in the report, it highlights, that's the point that the impression that I got, right? It was as if that the transition and the green transition was all rosy in the sense that it's beneficial, right? But at the same time, this transition comes at a cost, particularly to the people. The continent has the largest share of people under the poverty line. Now, a country like Senegal and Mauritania have discovered gas in huge quantities. For the past 4 or 5 years, they've been struggling to raise the needed financing to be able to extract these gas, mainly because the global financial architecture is moving away from, like carbon or fossil fuel, right, towards green transition, which is good, right, because we'll be able to save the planet from heating. But the point I was saying is that as an economist, I understand the point, but also as a Pan-Africanist, I struggle to get my head around it in the sense that why should the continent that pollutes the least amount be taxed to take on the burden on saving the planet from overheating when the powers that be that are actually polluting more are actually not doing the most, right? The developed countries that have the technology to be able to cut back on their emissions are actually not doing as much. But we're saying that, because a lot of these technologies are locked in, right? So we should not allow the poor countries to log into this carbon intensive technology because it takes a long time. But they should be forced to use the solar panels, which, by the way, are not produced on the continent, use a lot of the green technologies that are imported, right? And this continent also needs to create jobs. So I guess the point that I was trying to raise for the team, and I think it goes back to the report, and I'm looking at Cesar because he's starting a climate report. How can we think about these things and still say that, let's Africa do all the green transition? And I started the example that Germany, we all know, have started switching back their coal, right? And I always start this example. When the crisis came, the German chancellor was in Senegal, and the Senegalese president pointed out to him, well, we've been struggling to raise revenue to extract our gas. None of the banks were looking at it. Now you are here. Is it that the thing has changed? And recently I read that the EU has now reclassified gas as a clean fuel. The point I'm trying to raise is that how do we balance these two? Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent.
So thank you very much. The two questions you asked are actually very linked, because you also asked why is it that some countries have done better than others, even in responding to COVID, which is not. So for me, this goes to the roots of what we all do as African Development Bank, World Bank, IMF, and the rest of them, which is improving the basic structure of fundamentals of an economy. Because the whole question of adaptation, vulnerability, and climate readiness, like I tried to share very briefly in the report, shows that the economic structure and the fundamentals of any economy defines the resilience capacity of that economy to any shock, whether it's COVID or it is whatever pandemic or a health pandemic or a climate pandemic or anything else. And that dovetails to what you said very clearly. For countries, because we tried to look into this over time when I was working on the climate economics for IPCC, what you find is that at lower levels of development, poverty is the driver of emissions. So by trying to implement policies, just by growing the economies, you're already decoupling from CO2 emissions. And that is why I said briefly when I was presenting that some of these policies that tries to put a stop on those key drivers of growth like energy because of climate issues is counterproductive. So when you go to, that's an inflection point that you will find when the marginal returns to investments in particular sectors is higher than the marginal costs. That's where we want to be as economists. And then we find that what's interesting point in that analysis is that the same thing is that the level of externalities you get. And I was saying when we had the other meeting, I was a bit confused when I was getting this on my model. So I just had to walk the streets of Nairobi where I was living that time. And it was very clear. Cars that are like 40 years old are used for taxis. And the capacity of that car to convert fuel into distance covered is much lower. So you get less, purchase fuel for 10,000, whatever amount of money, currency you're using, maybe you get the value of 3,000 in terms of the mileage you can cover. But if it is in Europe or where you have better cars, newer cars, you cover more grounds, which means that the externalities you meet by just doing the same economic activity, traveling 1 mile, is like 10 times or 1,000 times apart. So that poverty, locking people into low-end technologies, is one of the most environmentally polluting sources that we have. And that is why having any policy that prevents a country in that group from growing its economy is counterproductive. You lose money, you lose jobs, you emit CO2 and carbon monoxide, cause more health challenges for people, and then also you pollute the environment. But when you get to the middle level, what I would call the efficiency level, you find that the marginal value product of investments is high. And so is but the marginal externalities you create per unit of economic activity is low. And the marginal impacts on social health and equity is also low. So in that case, you become more efficient on all goals that we are talking about here. So you can triangulate the social, the environmental, and economic goals. That for me is where we need to be. But the challenge is that when you cross the other inflection point, it's like a sigmoid curve when you map those things. When you cross the other inflection point, the marginal returns for economic activities is lower than necessary. In some cases, it's negative. But people just continue to consume because of the Jevons effect. But then also you find that the marginal externalities is also high per unit of economic activity. Just think of someone driving an SUV from here to Arizona. One person in a vehicle that should carry 6 or 10 people, because the person can afford it and he doesn't care about how much the fuel costs, because it's really crossed that level where he's not thinking much more about the economic cost, but just the surplus spending that he wants to get. And we have similar kinds of things in all sectors, in production, in consumption, and so on. So if we really want to be serious about environmental policy, we should be talking about bringing everybody back to that efficiency level. So lower income countries, let's grow their economy so they increase technical efficiency and decouple environmental harm from economic growth objectives. And for those who have gone the other side, bring it back. It's good for the economy, it's good for society, it's good for everyone. But the political economy of that discussion is a tough one. And I don't think it's one that I will, I will want to get into now. So, and that also links to the question you have asked now. You asked in terms of why should Africa care? I just put it that simply. I think significantly Africa needs to care. Because of that weakness in the structure of Africa's economies, Africa is the most impacted by climate change impacts. So if you say you don't care and we continue to use polluting technologies, we are going to continue to have that nature fighting back, and it will continue to wipe away the hard-earned economic growth objectives, like what has happened in Mozambique with Hurricane Idai and so on and so forth. So because we are weaker in Africa and can absorb the shocks less, the risk of the shock is higher for Africa than anywhere else in the world. So we should actually be driving that transition because it will help us remain afloat. That's number one. Then the second thing is the political economy of development today. We just talked about Germany switching on its coal. We didn't need to ask Africa. But Africa wants to invest in coal, it goes asking Germany. So that's the issue here, because also we don't have the capital to invest in endogenously in those development pathways. We need to find a way that will allow domestic revenue mobilization to grow, but also continue to maintain the financial inflows that will require to ensure that development in Africa can get to the level that it should be. And then the final point there is that what I call the economic competitiveness advantage. Look, we had the first industrial revolution, the second and the third. Africa lost out because we did not participate. This industrial revolution is already happening. So even as Germany is turning on its coal or whatever, gas or whatever, it's also leading on renewable energy technologies and occupying market shares. If you go to Kenya, you see Mkopa, it's a German company. And the government is investing in this research and development and technologies that will shape the future of the global economy. So when that time comes, if Africa is not investing in that area, we will be latecomers again. And then finally, the point which is related to bringing all these three together is asset stranding risks. If you invest and say, I found gas, I find coal, I don't care what others do, let me just use my mega resources and develop these. You finish developing them and technologies change, policies change, the markets change, who will buy your product? So you get asset stranding already happening. So for me, that answers your question and his question there, that as Africans, we need to care so much about this and actually lead the agenda. Because if we do, we have the most of the resources for these transitions. The only thing I don't advocate is that we do the transition using the current market paradigm, because we will lose out again. If Africa continues to sell battery minerals and buy lithium ion batteries, we will lose. So that's why for me, the discussion would be what kind of structural transformation policies can we implement to encourage countries and investors to invest in our resources in Africa, that will create the jobs we need, employ our youths, generate growth and everything, but also help save the planet. So it's for everyone and everyone will benefit. So that's why also, like in this trip, we have had, yesterday we were with the CEO of the Bezos Fund and so on, because we need the private sector to see the huge opportunities there are in Africa, and also in changing the model of, okay, let's go mine the resources and bring it over here, because that costs money. And that also creates a lot of carbon footprints as we go forward. So I wouldn't say let us not care. I would say let us care and hold everybody accountable, because we are actually suffering and suffering more and more because of this. Why are Chinese countries the ones investing investing in the battery minerals in Africa and so on. I think the global trade and supply chain issues has the political economy of it is very complex, and it depends on country by country cases. And the Europeans investing in. If you ask me, you say what would be my advice to the country? Don't sell your battery minerals. Get the investments come to your country. Just implement simple franchising policy and insist that at least to some level of refinement. If you look at cobalt, which it's also a battery mineral from Zambia, I think Anthony Simpasa's country, you'll find that when I looked at it in 2018, they are selling. They were I think about 43% of the global market in copper. Sorry, not cobalt. In raw copper. The whole market for that raw copper that year was 6.something billion US dollars. Chileans just buy that raw copper and turn it to copper ore. The global market is like 68 billion. If you went to copper concentrates, it jumps up. Then try produce the copper wires, jumps up even more. So why should Africa continue to trade on the lowest level of the value chain? That is not a policy that the global community needs to do for us, because it's in the interest of China to come buy it and produce it and sell it to you 10 times the price. This is just trade policies. So what Africans and African governments need to create those policies that allows localization of industries where the raw materials are, and it will help save the planet because of the carbon footprint I've talked to you about, and it will also help achieve the goals of alleviating poverty going forward. So in general, what I'm trying to push is that we need a holistic view of climate policy, putting it just as the world really did as one out of 17 goals, and not focus on it as a singular goal. Because if you do that and you have trade-offs, you create disincentives for implementation.
Excellent. I don't know if we have any other questions. We have 5 minutes. So if you have you have a question, you want to make a comment?
Unfortunately, more holistic work brought to the table, and basically what I was going to point out, which is we're talking about climate, but in any transition, whether it's a green transition or whether it's innovation or whether it's strengthening your insertion into value chains or going up the value chains, there's a lot of foundational investments that need to be done. There's a lot of complementary policies, right? I think Justice was talking about greening the economy, and he was talking about a lot of investments. Human capital is one. If we want to get into the digital industry, energy is key. So I think at this point in the discussion, especially when it comes to energy, we need to basically try to point it out in a way that we need to have an ordered transition in our energy mix if we're talking about Africa, because in this transition, green jobs are not going to be enough to create jobs for the young population that is coming into the market. You need a mix of brown and green jobs. Over time, those proportions will change, right? But I mean, I like the presentation. Thank you for that. But I was hoping that one of the messages would be these key foundational investments that need to be done, or these complementary policies that need to be in place. Because, for instance, in the example that you said, we need to move from having the cobalt to have batteries. The question is, the DRC have the institutions or have the foundations to make that transformation soon? And to what extent adaptation policies or mitigating or leveraging mitigating policies in advanced economies can be implemented in a way that they can structurally transform our economies? And I'll stop here.
We will have a chance later. I have several questions, but I will stay. I will ask them later. Mm-hmm. I have a question from Jerry Wabiru, who says, what happens when developed world does not need gas anymore? Will it be reclassified? And what are likely to be implications for Africa?
Okay.
So if you answer that, and then we'll close.
Okay, let me answer that in a very when we were preparing for COP27, there was a leader I wouldn't mention that says, look, the currency of this debate, the dialogue you are going for, the currency of climate change is carbon emissions. If you don't have it, don't come.
Indeed.
So for me,
you might suffer nonetheless.
So what I'm trying, you might suffer nonetheless, but even if you came and you don't have it, you actually don't have a voice. And there is some sense in what he's saying, what was said there. So Jerry, the thing what I would say is Africa should grow its economies so that it can be on the G20 table or G7 table, so that when Germany or any other country wants to reclassify gas, they will say no.
Exactly right. That makes perfect sense.
So, and with that, let me also say, please, this is just a beginning. There's quite a lot that could be done. The foundational policies you are talking about, we talked about that capacity building, and then the policy coordination. That's what we had in mind for those, but we couldn't really discuss everything in detail. But one of the reasons why we're here is to call for us to work together as MDBs and also the global community to bring knowledge that is not politically driven. That's actually based on research evidence, like we have tried to do in this report, to inform how these kinds of debates go. Because I have seen swings. We go to overarching focus on financialization of nature. We come to a lot of greening of nature, and we're just swinging from one side of a silo to the other, and that doesn't lead to sustainable development results. We need to start really thinking about how we triangulate all these policy goals so that we'll be able to create policies that are smart enough to address the issues that we have, so that countries like DR Congo, my friend Kevin Lumbila that is there, that they will be able to benefit from the huge carbon sequestration capacity of the peatlands in Congo. And it will take the global community to do that kind of analysis that brings to the fore the global benefits, global public goods that they are delivering. That country is not supposed to be poor in any way, because it's actually serving the world a lot of services. Thank you so much.
Well, Kevin and colleagues from the African Development Bank, thank you. I'm sure there is plenty that we can work on together, so I look forward to that. But for now, we probably have to bring this to an end, and then we will reconvene later in the afternoon.